If you've ever mistaken desire for love, if you've ever said yes with your body before your heart could speak, you're not alone. This isn't just a story about lust. It's about what happens when the fire fades and something deeper begins to grow. What starts as a craving, hot, fast, undeniable, slowly softens into something sacred. A kiss becomes a question, a touch becomes a truth, and in the silence after, where no words are spoken, everything is finally understood. This is where love lives, not in the passion but in the stillness after. Welcome to a story of transformation, a journey from heat to home, from wanting to being wanted in return. Hit that like button, subscribe, and stay with me. Because what comes next isn't just romance, it's awakening. It didn't begin with some grand emotional revelation or a sweet friendship that slowly turned into love. It started with hunger, plain, raw, physical hunger. The kind that crept under the skin and made its home in the silence between two glances held just a second too long. He walked into the room like he knew something others didn't, not loud, not trying. Just there, solid, the kind of presence that made air shift. There was nothing gentle about that first glance. It wasn't kindness or warmth, it was heat. It was the look of someone who had already made up his mind. And somehow, that certainty was intoxicating. Words didn't need to be perfect. Conversations didn't need to be deep. He didn't have to impress or convince or charm. Just standing there, speaking low and slow, letting his eyes do most of the work, he had already taken up space. Not just in the room, but in thought. That kind of want is dangerous. It doesn't wait. It doesn't negotiate. It pulls. It demands. It convinces without asking. And it felt like that, like falling, fast and foolish, and not caring one bit about the ground that was bound to catch. So when the time came, when the question was asked, not in some carefully orchestrated proposal, but in the quiet, private moment where bodies had already whispered what words hadn't, there was no hesitation. There was only the pulse, only the fire that refused to cool. Saying yes wasn't about love. It wasn't about soul, connection, or destiny, or forever. It was about desire, about the way his hands felt, the way his mouth moved, the way he looked when he didn't realize he was being watched. It was the kind of yes that comes from a place below thought, where logic can't survive. Marriage wasn't a dream of roses or white dresses. It wasn't some sacred vow crafted with tears. It was more like a dive into the deep end with eyes wide open, knowing full well this wasn't safety. It was surrender, and yet there was no regret, not at first, not when the nights were full of gasps and shivers, of skin against skin and breath laced with heat. The world didn't exist outside the room. There were no tomorrows, just the ache of now, and every time hands met in the dark, it felt like enough, like that kind of closeness could hold a life together. But passion has a strange way of exposing what it can't fulfill. In the quiet mornings, after the warmth faded and the light returned, there were questions, not out loud, just in the way silence lingered a little longer than it should, in the way eyes avoided each other across the table, in the way touch still happened, but without the electricity. It wasn't emptiness, not exactly. It was more like something missing, something that the body couldn't reach, something no amount of closeness could force. And yet he stayed close, not just in bed, but in the way he listened when the words finally came, in the way he sat without needing to fill the silence, in the way he didn't ask for more, but gave it anyway, slowly. That's when the shift began, not in some dramatic confession, not with flowers or long speeches, but in one night, one simple, quiet night, when his hands found a different rhythm. Not driven by want, but by care, not rushed, but reverent. The way he touched didn't feel like claiming, it felt like understanding, and for the first time, the body didn't just react, it received. Every inch of skin that had burned under him before now bloomed. Like it had been waiting all this time for that kind of slowness, that kind of seeing. He looked differently, too, as if something had softened, as if he finally noticed the breath that hitched, the tears that didn't fall, the quiet ache that wasn't physical at all. And when his arms wrapped around, it wasn't to pull close, it was to hold still. That night didn't end in fireworks. It ended in stillness, in two bodies tangled not from lust, but from something much deeper. Something that hummed low and steady and warm. From that moment on, everything changed. Desire still lived there. How could it not? But it no longer ruled. It no longer shouted. It simply stayed in the background, quietly fueling something richer. Something that touched where lust never could. That was the moment the marriage stopped being an escape. It stopped being a fire that threatened to burn out. It became something else entirely, a slow, steady warmth that never asked for more than presence. That didn't need to consume to matter, and in that warmth, love grew, real love, the kind that makes you look back on the hunger and realize it wasn't wrong, just incomplete. Not every beginning is perfect. But sometimes, the most imperfect beginnings lead to the truest endings. It wasn't a night that was planned. Nothing about it was choreographed or expected. No wine, no candles, no slow music to set the mood. Just two people, a shared silence, and something in the air that felt different. He didn't reach for anything at first. No pull, no pressure, just a presence, close, calm, and quietly aware. The kind of closeness that doesn't demand attention, but commands it anyway. There had been so many nights before, burning, breathless, full of desire. Nights when hands were fast, when mouths met like they were starving. Nights where the body was a battlefield of passion, and those nights were powerful in their own way. But this night, this was something else. It began with stillness, not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels full, like something sacred is about to happen, and the world is holding its breath. His hand didn't go for the obvious places. It rested first on the side of the face, a thumb grazing softly over a cheekbone, like he was memorizing the shape of emotion. Then his fingers moved, not fast, not slow, but present. Alive, like each inch of skin mattered, like it was the first time he was touching it, even though it wasn't. Something shifted inside. It wasn't arousal, not at first. It was awareness of breath, of being seen, of being known. The eyes met, and neither turned away. No smile, no words, just an unspoken question hanging in the space between, and something inside whispered, finally, when his lips brushed against the shoulder, not with hunger, but with reverence. Something broke open. A wall that had always stood quietly between pleasure and presence crumbled, and it wasn't just a kiss. It was a homecoming. The body had been his for a while now, given freely, eagerly, recklessly even. But this was different. This was the first time it was offered, not as an escape, not as a game, but as truth. And he received it like he knew the difference. He kissed like he wasn't trying to take, like he was listening, as if each breath, each sound, each pause was part of some deeper language only he could hear. There were no moans, no urgent gasps, just the quiet inhale of a soul being touched. The kind of intimacy that doesn't begin with friction. It begins with trust. When his hands moved lower, it wasn't with intention. It was with understanding, and the body didn't respond with fire. It responded with surrender. The kind that opens not to be conquered, but to be held. And he held with both hands, both eyes, all of him. It didn't feel like being wanted. It felt like being chosen. Somewhere in the middle of that night, when breath met breath and heartbeats slowed to match each other, a new kind of closeness took root. It wasn't about how close the bodies could be. It was about how close the souls already were. He whispered nothing, not because there was nothing to say, but because what was happening didn't need words. The silence spoke louder. Touch by touch, something deeper awakened. Not the thrill of lust, but the ache of being fully present with someone who finally saw what hadn't been shown to anyone else. And when the final moments came, slow, drawn out, tender, there was no need to rush. No chase for release, just the quiet ache of something real settling in. Afterward, there was no turning away, no cold space, no reaching for a phone, just the weight of his arms wrapping tighter and the stillness of a body that didn't want to move. Eyes closed, but the heart stayed wide open. There had been passion before, but this was the first time it felt like peace. This wasn't lust, it was awakening, and it changed everything. Something changed after that night. Not all at once, not in some grand, sweeping moment. It was slower than that, quieter, the kind of change that doesn't shout but gently settles into the space between two people, the kind that doesn't announce itself with declarations but with pauses. With the way he looked, with the way his hands moved, not to claim but to ask. The kisses weren't the same. They weren't desperate or urgent anymore. They had questions in them now, curious, gentle questions. Like he was trying to learn something he hadn't understood before, like each kiss was reaching for something deeper than skin. His breath near the neck wasn't just a sensation, it was an invitation, an asking, not a taking. And the way his fingers moved across the back, slow and warm, felt like tracing a memory, not a body. Every time he lingered, every time he didn't rush, it felt like he was waiting for permission that had already been given, but that he wanted to receive again in that moment, just to be sure. And that was what made it different. He could have taken, he could have leaned into the hunger, and there would have been no resistance, but he didn't. He slowed down, he softened, and in that softness, something else began to grow. It wasn't lust anymore. Lust comes loud and fast and burns bright. This was something quieter. It arrived in the silences between words, in the way he didn't speak, but stayed, in the way he held without gripping. There were moments, small, barely noticeable moments, when he would look across the room and just watch, not with desire, not with hunger, but with something else, something like wonder. Love doesn't always come charging in. Sometimes it creeps in softly, on the edge of breath and the tip of a finger. Sometimes it waits in the pauses, in the in-between, and that's where it lived now. In the mornings, when light touched the sheets and sleep still clung to the air, he would press his forehead gently against a shoulder and breathe. No words, no expectation, just presence. That kind of closeness doesn't ask for anything. It just holds, even the way he said good. Bye felt different. There was weight in it now, not sadness, just care. A kind of reverence, as if he knew something fragile had been placed in his hands and he didn't want to lose it. And at night, when arms reached and the body responded, it wasn't about release. It was about rhythm, about quiet communion, about the way hearts beat when they're no longer protecting themselves. Love started to fill in the spaces where lust had burned itself out. Not every touch was meant to ignite. Some were just meant to remind, to soothe, to say, I see you, still, even now. It was in the way he brushed hair behind the ear without speaking, the way he rested a hand over the heart and didn't move, the way he didn't need to be inside to feel close. He made it easy to stay vulnerable, and that, more than the fire, more than the chemistry, was what changed everything. It wasn't about being wanted anymore. It was about being known and still chosen. That kind of love doesn't roar. It hums. It pulses under the surface like a soft current. You don't even realize how deeply it's taken root until you look up one day and realize you wouldn't know how to breathe without it. And even when silence filled the room, it wasn't empty. It was full of the things that didn't need to be said, the shared knowing, the quiet safety, the steady presence. The body still remembered the passion, but the heart now reached for something more lasting, something that didn't flicker when things got quiet. That was how love grew, not in the grand gestures or loud promises, but in the space between breath and skin, where the world disappears and nothing else matters but the stillness of being held and holding back. He didn't have to ask anymore. He already knew. It wasn't a moment that announced itself. There was no shift in lighting, no dramatic music, no realization that screamed from the inside. It just happened, quietly, as most truths do. The nights hadn't stopped, the passion hadn't dulled, but something deeper had taken its place, a feeling that didn't need to chase or conquer, a presence that didn't need noise to be felt. It wasn't about the way he touched anymore. It was about what remained after the touch ended. The stillness after had its own language. There was a night, not unlike others, when everything slowed. The rhythm faded, breath softened, and time seemed to dissolve. There was no urgency, no pressure to speak or perform. Just two bodies wrapped around each other, not to escape the world, but to be still in it together. And in that silence, he didn't pull away. His arms only tightened, just slightly. His fingers curved softly around the back. He didn't reach for his phone, didn't roll to the edge of the bed. He didn't even move. He just held, quietly, deliberately. It wasn't to keep close what was already his. It was something more sacred than that. A kind of gratitude that didn't need to be named. A kind of reverence that spoke louder than any compliment ever could. There were no words, no whispered promises, no declarations of forever, and yet everything was said. Sometimes love doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes it sits in the quiet and waits to be felt. And in that moment, it was felt, not just on the skin, but inside, in the way the heart slowed down, in the way peace settled where restlessness used to live. Lust always fades. It burns fast, it takes what it wants, and it leaves behind ashes if it isn't rooted in more. But this didn't fade, it deepened. It stopped being about taking and started being about staying. Not just in the room, but emotionally, spiritually, fully. There was no more reaching out in the dark to make sure he was still there. No more listening for footsteps or breath to know he hadn't left. His presence was steady now, like air, like gravity, always there, always felt. And in that consistency, devotion was born. It didn't arrive with a grand gesture or a perfect sentence. It arrived in silence. In stillness, in the weight of him choosing to stay, not because of desire, but because of love. That's when it stopped being about the fire. It became the warmth that stayed after the fire died down. That's when it became a home. Love doesn't always start perfectly, but it can grow beautifully, in silence, in touch, in stillness. If this story stirred something inside you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to believe in that kind of love again. See you in the next chapter.